Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Space Cowboy Books Online. Tonight, we are here to celebrate the release of The Unvarnished out today from Gary Phillips, who will be joining us today for reading and interview. If you have any questions throughout the event, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of those. Gary Phillips has been a community activist, labor organizer, and has delivered dog cages. He's published various novels, comics, short stories, and edited several anthologies, including South Central Noir and the Anthony Award-winning The Obama Inheritance, 15 Stories of Conspiracy Noir. Violent Spring, first published in 1994, was named in 2020 one of the essential crime novels of Los Angeles. He's also the writer and co-producer of FX's Snowfall, streaming on Hulu, about crack and the CIA in the 1980s, South Central where he grew up. Recent novels include One Shot Harry and Matthew Henson and the Ice Temple of Harlem. He lives with his family in the wilds of Los Angeles. I'm going to hand it over to Gary to read us an excerpt from the book.
Well, thank you, Jean-Paul. Thanks so much for having me on the Space Cowboys Bookstore podcast. I'm going to read just a kind of brief intro, as it were, or introduction to the first story in the book, which is called Demon of the Track. And it's set, I guess we'll talk about it in a little bit. But anyway, it's set in late 50s Los Angeles. And as well, people will see what it is. All right. Adam Deacon Coles tapped the brakes and swung his 41 Willis coupe to the right, its high beams illuminating the edge of the drop-off. The green Mercury with a supercharger scoop sticking out of the hood brushed against the side of his car. He didn't care about the body, it was full of dents, and the fenders and passenger door were mismatched colors obtained from the salvage yard. But he didn't want the Merc knocking him over the edge of the rise as they took the turn. The Mercury was on the inside of the curve, plumes of dirt and loose rocks clouding behind both cars as they sped, their rear ends bumping twice together, then apart again. Each car had big bore engines in them and were not stock. Their mechanic drivers had cut and welded and pounded to fit them into their respective vehicles. The roar of those engines filled the cabs of each car as their owners sought dominance. The race crowd hooped and hollered and made other joyous noises down where the race started and went in. Behind the gathered rose a wide ramp of the Santa Monica Freeway under construction, a mass of concrete and rebar sticking out of the end of it. The ramp had been sawed off as if by a storm giant, for this was as far as the work had taken the builders. The goal was to build a byway connecting downtown to the coast. In the process, the homes of working class Black folks in what was called the Pico District, people who'd come west in the 30s and 40s to work the then boom of oil fields and later aircraft, had been snatched up by eminent domain. Those same homes were rented back to them before they were kicked out and the houses tore down to make way for the rivers of freeway cement. The race took place primarily on a snake of land that had been bulldozed to gradually rise nearly a quarter mile up, then took a whip turn around to descend into a flattened, cleared area that once housed a park and an apartment complex. Now there were stands of unfinished pylons and piles of concrete and wood and glass debris from demolished homes to maneuver around. Then another turn through a partially fenced-in area where several heavy-duty trucks and tractors and the crowd were gathered, back to the rise of land again. To add to the difficulty, it was now dusk and the natural light fading, so a driver's vision and reflexes had to be sharp. The improvised racetrack was a rough oval. The racers had to drive around 10 times. This was the 8th lap. They came out of the turn, the Merc taking the lead. Downhill the cars plowed, the Willis running over a chunk of concrete, which Coles prayed didn't blow out his tire. Reaching the flattened area, he swerved around a pylon, the Merc now on his right flank. The other car zigged and zagged between two interspersed pylons and veered back toward Coles' car. Traveling at more than 90 miles an hour, both were honing in on another pylon, dead center, piled concrete on either side of the two vehicles. Coles went left and the other car gobbled distance opposite. but the Willis hit a sizable rut in the earth that would have snapped the front axle in half given the speed they were traveling. Coles smiled ruefully. Fortunately, he'd installed hydraulics taken from a junked World War II airplane wing in the front leaf springs connected to the straight axle. This helped absorb the impact. Good thing he'd run into a man he knew, Ron Aguirre, at a car show about a year ago, and Aguirre had shown him the hydraulics he'd installed on a custom car he called a lowrider. At the flick of a toggle switch, he could lift and lower the car's shell. Now, as they reached the other turn, Coles pressed down again on the accelerator, then pulled up the handbrake in a maneuver he'd been practicing. He fishtailed through the turn, forcing the Merc to swing wider to avoid his car. In this way, he gained the lead as he straightened out. They whished past the crowd. Coles kept in front, but the Mercury was tight on his tail. As they got near the top again of the quarter-mile dirt rise, the Merc attempted to gain an advantage by powering through the turn, but the driver miscalculated when to apply the gas. And just as he was about to complete the turn, momentum caused the rear end to lose purchase, and the car skidded over the side of the dirt ramp. It rolled twice and landed upright down below. Coles completed the race, then ran from his car once he'd shut it off to see about his opponent. Someone had already gotten the other driver free from his wrecked vehicle. Fortunately, both cars had roll bars installed on the interior. "You okay, Sack?" Coles asked William Sakamoto. The other driver's face was cut and bruised. "Looks like I'll live, Deke." He took a step, but his knee buckled. Coles put a hand under his arm. "Okay, maybe I'll sit down a minute," he grinned. Bystanders laughed and clapped, the two on their backs. Somebody had a folding chair and set it up for Sakamoto to sit. A few kerosene camping lanterns had been brought, and these were lit against the oncoming night. Some of the people left and others milled about, talking about the race or examining the Mercury while drinking beers. The smell of marijuana drifted about, and one beatnik sat on the crinkled fender of the Mercury, wailing on his bongos. "Good race, Deke," said a blonde in striped pants and a sweater top. She handed him a can of hams. "You're the coolest, Dory." "Ain't I?" she said, wandering away. A tall man in a snap-brim hat and a Hawaiian shirt stepped over to Coles. The night was warm. "Mind if I had a word with you, Mr. Coles?" They were near the Willis, and Coles leaned against the driver's door. "What can I do for you?" Coles was in rolled-up sleeves, tan chinos, and wore heavy work boots. His hair was close-cropped, and a scar ran part of the length of his jawline. "My name is Fred Warrens." He was in his late 40s, brown hair long at the nape of his neck, and with hazel eyes. He had a trim mustache and knobby knuckles. Cole showed interest. "You manage the Sentinel Speedway, don't you?" "Yes, sir." "What can I do for you, Mr. Warrens?" "I want you to race at our track." Coles chuckled harshly. "What? You going to bring a Negro to the races night?" He chuckled some more. Uncomfortable, Warren frowned. "That's a crude way of putting it, Mr. Coles, but we would like to offer you a featured spot. I know something of your record. Fighter pilot in Korea, flying Mustangs in the F-80 jets, over 75 missions and 10 confirmed kills in air combat. The Deacon of the Air, they called you." "Yeah, well," he said dismissively, "you read that old article about me in Ebony, so I guess that makes you an all right sort of guy, huh?" That wasn't in that article. What wasn't in that article is since the war, you've been building and racing hot rods and pickup contests all over town. A lot of people, black and white, talk you up. "Yeah, well, it still means me and mine is unwelcome at your all's precious racetrack all over town." Warrens looked off for a few people dancing and snapping their fingers as the bongo man beat out a frenzied rhythm. He looked back at Coles. Let me put the cards on the table, okay?" "Please do. It's no secret that Inglewood is changing. Well, we think we need to change with the times, too." Sentinel Speedway was on a hill overlooking Sentinel Avenue in Inglewood. Uh-huh. Coles rolled his arms. "You mean them colored folk we've been buying homes near the plant near after the big one has also meant you go to the races, we go to racing and have noticed the lack of shade down on the track." Looking past Warren's shoulder, Coles couldn't help but notice a Mexican-American woman he hadn't seen around before. She was dark-haired and copper-hued, wearing black jeans and a black top, lantern light glinting off gold hoop earrings. She was something. She glanced his way, then smiled as a man in a t-shirt offered her a toke on the tea, the marijuana. The woman declined. "The Inglewood chapter NAACP has threatened a boycott campaign," Warren said. "They've been very active when it comes to jobs and promotions at North American Aviation. Cole smiled bemusingly. Did you tell him you had a couple of black fellows working in your track already, Mr. Warrens? Both of them janitors, I believe. Now, ain't that so? Warren spread his arms. As I said, we want to do things differently and bring some colors onto the pit crews, Coles countered. We can't demand that of a racer and his sponsors. That's their decisions to make. But you want me to shuck and jive at some kind of hooped up show, ain't that right? Make sure the cameras are there on me after the race, and I got this big shaking grin on my mug, thanking you and the Lord for this special, special day. Maybe take a knee and break into mammy while I'm at it. You're looking at this all wrong, Mr. Coles.
Thank you for sharing that excerpt with us, Gary. So
Thank you.
this book is a lot of fun because it's a Mondo pulp collection, and I mean, you took on almost everything the pulps did, from boxing stories, dinosaurs, science fiction, drag racing. It's all over the place. So, what drew you to want to write in the style of the pulps?
Well, I've long been a crime fiction writer, but I've also long been a short story writer. That is to say, I've written, crime fiction novels, as well as you mentioned, done some stuff on TV. But in my short stories, I've always kind of experimented. That is to say, it'll start with crime fiction, but then I'll leak in some kind of sci-fi element, or as you mentioned, like some other kind of pulp element. And because I think of the short story form, I guess I feel more freer to experiment and kind of fool around. Whereas if I'm writing like One Shot Harry, if I'm writing a novel set in 63 LA, well, then and it's supposed to be about crime fiction and mystery, then I kind of feel obliged to sort of deliver that. Whereas a short story, I think it might throw the reader for a loop, but at least it won't throw them for a loop for long. And if they don't dig it, well, there's something else they can read. But in that way, I think I feel more freer to experiment.
Well, I thought it was really fun that it went to all those different places.
Well, I
So,
appreciate that. Thank you.
yeah, the stories in this book take place in all different time periods, um, but they're totally cohesive stylistically. So, how did you navigate this as a writer, and how do you go about doing your research for writing in different time periods?
That's a good question. Well, there are some time periods you can be very earnest about your research, and I think I am in that regard. So I have various, I don't know, Bibles. I guess that's the way to put them. Various books that I keep at hand that particularly talk about the history, the political history, as well as a sort of social history of Los Angeles, because a lot of my stories are set in LA, or in the past and the present. So there's that. But you're right. There are other things. For instance, obviously, you're writing a story about the Old West. Well, you should probably bone up a little bit more than just watching some old westerns on TV. You might want to try to bone up on a few books and studies of the Old West, at least the real Old West. Even if I'm going to depart from that West, I should at least have some sense of the grounding, some sense of what was really happening then, as opposed to this sort of making it up from whole cloth. And then there are certainly at other times, in a story, I'll create a certain building, or I'm pretty faithful about addresses and landmarks and that kind of thing, and streets that should be perpendicular. I don't make them parallel, that sort of thing. But if I need to put a building somewhere where it didn't exist, then I will do that. And then, as well as, if sometimes there are certainly cases where you need to bring people from one period of time, or some of those traits from a person from a certain period of time, and maybe use them in another period of time. So I feel free to do that, and as well as, then, as long as of course I give those characters a certain kind of grounding. But yeah, I think so. I tend to do that research that at least helps me to locate a place if I haven't been to the place, or I haven't talked to people in the place, and then at least have some kind of sense of what I'm departing from, as I write the story.
Cool. Once again, anyone in the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. So you mentioned LA a minute ago, and LA definitely plays a predominant role in a lot of these stories. How did growing up in the city inform your writing?
Yeah, it really well as I think as all lot of writers talk about, and certainly they talk about in terms of the places they've grown up in, or the places maybe that they've moved to, but have spent a lot of time in. Invariably, then those places become characters in your book, and they kind of occupy a kind of space that then you invariably revisit and return to. Having said that, so that for instance, I grew up in South Central, but I grew up in South Central. Uh, it's sobering to say several decades ago, and the South Central I grew up in is not the South Central of now. And so I'm also careful that when I'm writing a story, let's say set now in well, I guess we're not supposed to call it South Central, South LA, but set in South LA, well, I probably should go back and revisit my old haunts, because some of those old haunts don't exist. And I should really get a sense of who those people are now. Or if I'm setting a story in, let's say, among the Hmong community in Long Beach, well, I probably should go and hang out and hopefully meet somebody in that community and talk with some folks and get some sense of the sounds and sights and all that kind of stuff that needs to populate a story, that needs to make it come alive, so that even if your character is an outsider, you do want to be accurate about what that outsider is observing, whatever area that they're in.
So LA is always changing. It's always in flux. Like I used to live there, but now I only go there once a year or so, and I'm always like, damn, where'd the stuff I know go? And it's
Right.
changed. So as a character, it's changed. And clearly LA is a character in a lot of your stories. But in your head, like, are there any books that exemplify like the LA that's in your mind?
That's actually a very good question, John. But yeah, certainly it's certainly the case that uh, there are books. My buddy Walter Mosley's books, the Easy Rollins books, were just set in certain time periods, kind of moving forward. Uh, those I think capture a kind of LA. It may be an LA that's more mythical in some ways, which is I think is fine. So that, as an example, this is not about LA, but I'll get back to LA. Chester Himes, who actually really didn't spend much time in Harlem, nonetheless wrote these crazy, absurdist Harlem mysteries with his two plainclothes cop characters, Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson, and yet and still he gave you a Harlem right of the mind. He gave you a Harlem, a kind of an alternate reality Harlem. And so, to a certain extent, there are books, and even Himes wrote a novel set here in Los Angeles. But set in the '40s. So there are certain books that John Fonte comes to mind as well. There are certain books that have a kind of sense of the Southland or sense of LA, in terms of a kind of emotional being to it, emotional ties that I think you want to then, as a writer, hopefully bring forward in your work. But it might not always be, I guess I'm going to contradict myself. So it might not always be accurate to what the city is at that moment, or what that area of town is at that moment. But I think as long as you're aware that you're kind of departing from that, I think that's all right. As opposed to, I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to be egotistical. And because I grew up there, therefore I know everything. And therefore I'm just going to show you, I'm going to, write this part about this part of the city, when in fact I haven't done my homework. I think you can depart from the reality, but I think you should be aware of the reality that you are not dismissing, but that you're incorporating in your story, in the way you want to tell uh, uh, the the plot, the characters, put them on the page. I think as long as you're aware of that, I think that's okay.
So another thing that plays a predominant role in a lot of these stories is cars and trucks, cla classic and otherwise. Um, and it's really like character, like the one you just read with the drag racing and stuff. It's really kind of one of the characters in the story. So tell us about your interest in vehicles and why they find their way into so many of the stories.
My dad was a mechanic. He was a poor boy from a little town in Texas, And so all of Phillips' brothers, the three boys, there was a sister too, my aunt Margaret, but the three boys were to one degree or another mechanics. The first car they had was a Model A, which is the car after the Model T, and the story goes they managed to wrap that car around a telephone pole one night, because in those days, you didn't have to have you didn't get a driver's license as long as your foot could reach the accelerator, the clutch, and the brake. Then you could drive. And rather than junk the car, they took the thing apart and they put it back together again. So they finally figured out, they're teenagers, and they finally figured out, well, hey, this is something we could do, and this will get us out of this dinky ass town of ours, because we certainly don't want to be working down here on the farm for the next 30 years. And so they all kind of split, and eventually my dad, actually my uncle, his older brother, gets out here first, and then my dad follows, because they went east and then came west. And they worked as mechanics. And when all three were in World War II, they all three survived World War II. My uncle was among the black expatriates who stayed in France after the war, and he opened a garage and sold cars and fixed cars. And Pop's vacations were often going over there working in the garage on Citrons and French Fords. But so cars always played a big part of my life growing up, and I learned to be something of a shade tree mechanic, not as versed as my pops. But so all that to say is that, yeah, invariably I always think about, when I have a character in mind, I always think, what is the car that character drives, right? What is the car that says something about who they are? And invariably, of course, it's some kind of older car. Invariably it's never a sports car. For some reason, I've never been attracted to sports cars like Ferraris or Porsches or anything like that. I mean, they're fine cars, but there's nothing. I don't know. There's nothing stylistic that appeals to me. So it's always some sort of older American muscle car, possibly, or just something older and just strange and odd, like Harry drives an old Plymouth Belvedere, because there's nothing any particularly enticing about a Plymouth Belvedere other than it's kind of an odd looking car from the 50s. To me, the cars, the trucks, the things that move around us, it just have this kind of to me, have a kind of spiritual connection with my characters. And so I'm always kind of cognizant again of what kind of car do I give that character, and if I'm going to destroy that car, what is the impact of the character when that happens, because it's like losing a member of the family.
We got one from the audience here. This is a two-part question. When do you know you have enough cultural background for a specific to write in a specific time period? Mm. And then also, you mentioned connecting with someone in those areas, etc. What are some of those intimate places that you pull away in your process of analysis to connect that sentiment with the story you're working on?
Pieces.
A thesis?
No. I say pieces instead of places. Like some.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, every artist has their own unique eye and what uses it whenever they're in their analysis process. So I was just curious as to what yours is and what you kind of hone in on.
That's a interesting question. I'm going to give another somewhat long-winded answer, but this will all sort of come together, I think. When we were in the writer's room on Snowfall, because Snowfall is set in a very specific time period, right? The 80s here in Los Angeles. And having lived, me and a couple others in the room, being the old men, having lived through that, we had a certain kind of memory and a certain kind of perspective. That actually might not always jibe with reality, but it still was a point of view because you had lived it. And I emphasize that to say that's why, to me, it's always great if you can find somebody who's lived through that experience or lived in that area or worked in that area at that time period, whatever the time period is. And if you can't find that, it could be the 30s, it could be the 40s, they may not be around. If you can find some kind of interview with them or some kind of essays written about that time period, more than just looking at photographs and what have you, so that the better you can kind of immerse yourself with any given area. I think so much, you can bring that to the table. Now, having said that, it also says you can't do an information dump, right? You can't just have all this, you got all this stuff, right? This is big, the top of the funnel is all this information and all this sort of data. But in the end, you might wind up just using that for 2 or 3 sentences and that's it. But that's okay because you've distilled it down or you've gotten the essence of what it is that you needed to make that sound correct for that character at that time period. So we wrestled with a lot of that in terms of in the Snowfall room, just in terms of like, what are we showing on screen? What would have been the reality? What was the Crash unit, which was under Gates, which is the anti-gang unit? What was Crash really like? What kind of mindset of cops was in that unit? What did the projects look like in those days? All that kind of stuff that helps to ground your story, whether it's a visual story or it's a story on the page, I think is important. But it also says that, as I said, you can't, you always want to be careful about putting too much, right? That the less is more kind of lesson, which is to say, I can know enough stuff that therefore I can hone it down and just bring the just enough of the information or just enough of the reality to hopefully then move my story along and help it to ground the characters.
So, in my favorite story in this collection, it's called Shade Rock, the Soul Shaker, because you got characters battling music, and I just thought that was like such a visually amazing thing, and music shows up in a lot of the stories, specifically era-specific music and whatnot. So what music inspires you? Do you listen to music when you're writing? And was this story in any way inspired by composers like Sun Ra or like the album covers, some of Rick James album covers?
Right,
Because
exactly.
it brought those to mind for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, certainly the late lamented Rick James was an influence on the character because and certainly Rick James in the period when after he had his stroke, because that's kind of how we come to our character, to Shade Rock in the story, as he's trying to get the soundtrack together, and the sound is elusive, right? He can't quite capture the magic, that he's looking for to make this happen. And so, yes, so the answer is a lot of times I just actually have the radio going, just like news or something like that, because it's just kind of background. But then occasionally, yes, I mean, I'll have what's the case? A morning becomes eclectic, so I'll have that going, and then there's something that comes on that then diverts my attention, but then I'll listen to it, or then sometimes I put on the jazz station, or sometimes I put on just kind of weird little loops, like 70s Japanese funk, on from YouTube. You know what I mean? So stuff like that that'll just kind of I just find invigorating and kind of keeps me, I guess, in the mood or in the flow. And it's not, and the story doesn't have to have anything to do with music. It could be something else entirely, or it could just be a scene I'm working on. But the music helps me kind of, I guess, visualize and be part of that scene. So yeah, so for certain kinds of funk, jazz, Sun Ra, Parliament Funkadelic. We were mentioning, I was mentioning Eddie Hazel, the great guitarist who died young, who was that great, does the great guitar solo on Maggot Brain, on the Funkadelic album. And so stuff like that invariably bubbles up in my head, and either I get a yin to put it on and just kind of listen to it as I work, or as I'm taking a break, and then you kind of just let it flow, and as you kind of float with it, maybe that helps to inspire the next passages I'm going to write. Or even if it doesn't do that, at least it's kind of soothing in a certain way, and it then helps you then recharge. So yeah, I mean, and I'm so jealous because I can't play an instrument and I can't sing, and so I'm always just jealous of people who can do that, because I just think it's such a wonderful wonderful skill, a wonderful gift. But I certainly am appreciative of folks who can, who can bring the sound, who can bring those sounds to us.
I thought it was cool because music, like cars, is such a part of our life, our environment,
Right.
and so
Right.
that enriched it. And you could pretty much make a playlist of tracks that are in this book, which a lot of them were playing in my head while I was reading. So it's cool. There's like a whole album worth of
Oh,
music
that's great.
at least. So you're also an activist in another area of your life. How has this part of your life informed your storytelling?
I'm certainly less of an activist these days than back in the halcyon days of old. But it is certainly the case that having been a community organizer and worked around police abuse issues as kind of my baptism of fire early on from back in the 70s, I guess it was in college, or late 70s in college, and I worked for unions, and I've just recently been on strike with my union, the WGA, for about 5 months. So the idea that people come together to try to affect change, and that there are these kind of layers of history, right, in our worlds that we populate, things that are known and things that are unknown, kind of the people's history versus the written history, are just fascinating to me. And again, it's like learning this stuff and reading about it, or hunting down a certain uh, uh, person that you didn't know about, and there's a book about that person, or there's at least some kind of interview with that person, or maybe they're even on tape. It's just fascinating to me, and it's just wonderful when you discover that stuff and can then use it, in your work.
So are you happy with the way things have panned out with the WGA?
I think, in general, Jean-Paul, that, well, there's two things. Yes, I'm happy with the discussion insofar as the bonus kind of thing and the back end stuff when it comes to streaming. The reality, though, is in terms of the AI stuff, yeah, I think um, that digital genie is out the bottle, man, and there's certain guardrails that are in the master agreement that we just ratified, overwhelmingly, I might add. But AI is here to stay. It ain't like it's not going away, and the idea that you can generate scripts and manuscripts and essays and what have you via artificial intelligence, and that artificial intelligence is using my work and other people's work. Was it called scraping that work to teach yourself how to write, and to write in certain kind of idioms, and to write in certain kind of ways. And what do they call them? I think there's a thing called a prompt engineer. The prompt engineer is a new niche that's going to only get worse, I suppose. So, I guess really the answer is, as a writer, I have to figure out how to use AI to my advantage as opposed to being steamrolled.
The AI thing is such a weird mess. And it's funny coming from a science fiction background. It's like, oh, we told you so that this was gonna suck.
That's right, right.
But yeah, that's a weird one. And if I could ask one more question about that, historically writers have been underpaid. Now we're up against this fucking machine that's gonna make that even worse. Why do you think that is? Because we all love books, we all love movies, comics, video games. I mean,
Right.
the writer has such a special role in the internal life of the people and their imaginations. Why do you think the writer's never been treated with the respect and the payment they deserve for this?
Man, that's a very deep question. Wow. I think it's always been, or not always been, but part of it's always been the fact that, on one hand, if you look at it from outside, you figure, well, that's easy. Anybody can put these words together, but not realizing how much you're sweating to try to get the right words, or try to get the right feeling, or try to communicate a certain kind of something with these two characters at this particular moment as distinct from another particular moment. And the fact that, yes, that in the end, it's just words on paper, so therefore it has a tendency to be undervalued. It's not reality, right? It's just these words, 26 letters of the alphabet, and they're all kind of rearranged and repositioned and redone or reworked. So I think there's a certain kind of dismissal about that, but there's also a certain kind of alchemy, I think, that we as writers try to master. And not to say that I've done it, but I think you're always trying to get there. You're kind of like Shade Rock, right? You're always trying to get back to the magic. You're always trying to capture, for that brief moment in time, when the reader is reading your pages or hearing your dialogue on the screen, be it big or small, or on the radio or what have you. And if you can transport the listener, the viewer, the reader, for however long that scene is happening, and bring them into that reality, wow, that's just wonderful, right? That's just terrific. And so I think we're always, at least I'm always trying to figure that out. I'm always trying to, again, put that lightning back in the bottle, if only momentarily. And I think, and having said that, then, like, to your point, I think there's a authors guild study. I just read the summary of it today, and still in all, writers who write books are still making like a median income of less than 20 grand a year as a if you're just writing books. I mean, they do other things obviously to make money, to keep food on the table, to keep the lights on, but the idea that book advances are not that big, or often not that big. Some are very big. Patterson's advances are astronomical. Mr. King's advances are astronomical, but not everybody gets those advances. And so the idea that, even given that, right, even given these odds, even given the notion of the Sisyphean task of pushing this rock up a hill to get your book noticed over other books, all that being said, it is still the siren call that draws some people back to the keyboard, to the page, whatever it is, to want to tell a story, to want to communicate in a certain way with an audience, whether the audience is 2 people or 2,000 people. And that is a great burning desire. Now, I don't think the machine can emulate that, at least not yet. And so I think as long as we have that going for us, that kind of spark that we're trying to preserve and trying to ignite, among other folks reading our work, I think it'll keep us going. But it is tough. It's always been rugged. I mean, listen, man, the idea of me stumbling into TV work versus these years of knocking around and being a book writer is kind of interesting. It's just, I just thank my lucky stars, but it is an interesting comparison in terms of, like, what is it, the the wages of sin that I'm engaged in, whether it's books or on the screen.
I tend to think of storytelling as our shared emotional history, and a way to get into someone else's mind and experience what they went through. And I can't imagine the machine taking over on that because it has no life experience,
Well, I'm hoping that, Jean Paul, but who knows? 100 years from now, I don't know, man. Isn't that as you said, man? That's been the warning cry from science fiction since the late 20s, right? Since the term robot was first, or android was first, coined. I mean, the idea that the machine could eventually imitate emotion, or the machine could gain self-awareness, right? And so does that mean it's Skynet and Terminator time, or does that mean that we exist shoulder to shoulder with them?
It'll be interesting to see how that pans out, especially if it gets sentient.
That's right. That's it.
So, you're also a novelist, but you write a lot of short fiction. Do you have a preference to format and why? And then also, how writing for TV, how's that differed for you? And which process do you like best?
Well, they're all different, but they all have certain similarities. So it is certainly the case that writing for TV, because you don't have you don't have the same amount of real estate that you have in a novel, and so therefore, brevity and conciseness and all that kind of thing, comes into play. So there is that. Uh, uh, Short stories are by necessity uh, uh, not going to have a bunch of subplots, right? Because you don't have that kind of time, you don't have that kind of space. That doesn't mean you can't have twists and turns, but you have to be thinking about that. You have to be honing that. You have to be on your game. I think when you're writing the short story, the novel. Not to say that you can just be leisurely and just not worry about pace in a novel. You do have to worry about pace in a novel as well, the highs and lows and all that kind of stuff. So I like the challenge, and then and then I write comic books now and then. So I like the challenges of all these kinds of forms of storytelling, and I think each one then does inform the other to a certain extent. And so there's no real particular favorite. I mean, yes, it is great though to write a script and hear an actor bring that alive, or hear even just an audiobook of your short stories or of your novels come alive from the right kind of voice actor over the just for the ears. So there's a certain kind of added benefit, obviously, to having that kind of thing happen with your work, as opposed to just the book and just you and kind of however the reader interprets the material. But uh, all of them are fascinating to me, and I'm just happy that I'm able to ply my trade in these various formats, and kind of weave my way around and through them and come back to them and go away from them and that kind of thing. So yeah, I just dig it. I mean, I'm happy that I can experience that and have been around long enough to see some benefit from that.
Here's another question from the audience. The AI questions lead me to the current book banning efforts in the US. Do you have any thoughts on how to push through or go around this current era of book bannings to keep authors writing their stories?
Well, there's efforts, by Penn and Move On and some other organizations. In fact, I think Penn is opening up a anti-book banning office in the heart of book banning country, Florida, where I think more than 40% of the book bans are in Florida, although there's a good number in Texas as well. But it suggests, by the way, in this era of electronic books and ebooks and Kindle readers, I mean, honestly, do any of these book bans really? I mean, yes, they can keep books off the shelf. I get that. I understand that, and they should be on the shelves, and parents should monitor what their kids read and make that decision. Them and their kids should make that decision whether they want to have them read this or not. But they should make that decision for other parents and children. And of course, the book banning really isn't about that. It's really about a political move to. In the end, it's really about the right wing wanting to destroy the public school system. But the idea that, at least in this day and age, I mean, the good news is in this day and age, as opposed to back in the day when they could take a book and burn it and that was the end of it, or take a comic book and put them on the bonfire and that was the end of it. The idea that this material exists, cyberly, it exists in digital form, and it, in fact, can be obtained, and you now have uh, bookmobiles going around giving out the books that have been banned. I think those are just positive fight backs against what is really just a part of the ongoing agenda that the right wing has always had, or has had for some time. I should say, not always had, but has had for some time in destroying the public education system. So I think the more we are organized, taking a lesson from organizing, the more we are organized and the more we are vocal about why it is that these books should be read or should be available to be read, so much the better.
I'm hoping that it goes the way of the parental advisory on records, which just helped sell records.
Exactly. Well, exactly.
Um,
That's right. That's right.
So, shifting gears a little bit here, from the politics to something really fun in the book here. You revived a public domain character from the 40s and wrote
Yes.
some pulp stories around the character Phantasmo. Why did you choose Phantasmo to revive?
Well, one, he's in public domain, so there is that. But I do certainly acknowledge his origin and where he sprang from. And I think it was kind of I had known about this character for a while, but in particular I knew about the artist who created him, or at least is credit with creating him in several quarters, including the book by I'm blanking. Oh my goodness, Quattro, King Quattro's book about black pioneers in comics. E.C. Stoner, Emil Cecil Stoner, created this character in 1940. And he's kind of, in certain ways, he's kind of typical of the time period. He's the playboy who's been to the east, been to Tibet. I guess he was in Tibet for 25 years. He's in Tibet for a long time, studying with the masters and all this sort of stuff. And he comes back and he's got all these mystical powers and what have you. And he can astral project. He can leave his body, but when he leaves his body, his physical form, or at least his form as the normal guy, goes limp. And but then as Phantasmo, he can solidify that form and he can become giant size and what have you, this and that. But again, I was more fascinated because it was Stoner who was this kind of who has now become more known. But when I stumbled on him like several years ago, he wasn't as well known, and eventually, actually, Stoner eventually leaves comics and becomes a fine artist. So I was just interested in taking that character and, as they say now, to retcon him, to reimagine him, to re-envision him as a modern day creation, but to also have some fun with it. So that how is it that if in the 40s the character is white and then I present him as black, well, how did that happen? And I don't ignore that history, and so I kind of play with that history, but I also play with the powers of Phantasmo, and I hopefully I kind of leave people along and weave some of that in. And so there's a kind of retro pulp sensibility, I suppose is the right term, right? Where you taking this kind of pulpish golden age comics character and reimagining him and re-envisioning him in a modern setting. And so there are certain things that I carry over from that time period, as well as then add to it as we see him active in this time period. But all that to say is I just got a lot of great fun out of reworking the character. There's several other characters that are around kind of like that eventually I'd like to get to as well.
So, do you think you'll be doing some more Phantasmo stories?
Yes, I'll be doing some more Phantasmo stories. I would love to do a Phantasmo, graphic novel if I could do it. But yes, definitely at least in prose, I'm going to be doing some more Phantasmo stories, and eventually, I'm hoping then to bring them to the world of comics as well.
So in the Phantasmo story in this collection, the Unvarnished, there's some great illustrations by the same person who did the cover, if I'm remembering
Yes,
correctly. What was it like working with the illustrator on this story?
we should mention that young man's name, Adam Bennett Shaw, who's just a wonderful illustrator, and he and I are working on a couple of other projects we're trying to get off the ground. So, and I had briefly kind of interacted with Adam on a couple of other projects, including this anthology I helped to bring to fruition a few years ago called Black Pulp, which was the idea then of taking uh, 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 people of color who, if they showed up in 30s and 40s pulps, were often either just tertiary character or stereotypically depicted, and sort of reimagining and re-envisioning that as Center Stage. So, and Adam had done the covers for Black Pulp 1 and 2, and then we also did with my buddy Tommy, Pro Se Press. We also did Asian Pulp, and he did that cover. And so I knew it was work, and like I said, we had interacted briefly on those projects, and I just knew that once I got the green light from Peter to do the new Phantasmal story, that we could add a few illustrations. I just knew that he would be the guy to realize this and to bring it whole to the page. And yes, and as they say, right? I mean, the old adage about, I mean, it is just so true that, I mean, that's really the charge, I think, when you work in comics or even TV, which is to say, to visually see what you kind of imagine in your head, right? To see that kind of realized in a certain way, it's just always such a gas, man. It's just so cool. So, and again, you know, I I became a writer because when I was a young man, when I was in my teens, we all did our amateur comic books in the first wave of first days of fandom, and I had visions of writing and drawing my own comics, and it turned out I'm not too good an artist, but I kept at the writing. So the idea of working with illustrators who really know their craft and know their stuff and deliver the goods, man, it's just, you can't beat it. You can't.
Delightful. So what are you currently working on, and what's coming up next for you, especially now that the strike is over?
Now that the strike is over, you know, there's a couple of things, a couple of projects we were percolating on, tuning up before the strike in terms of that world, the TV world. So we kind of trying to see if we can get those back on track. There's been a little interest from another quarter in terms of optioning One Shot Harry. So, you know, we'll see about that. But, you know, I don't. I've been around long enough, and having had a few of my books and even a short story and even a graphic novel option in the past. I try not to get the carts too far ahead of the horses, and don't get too excited about these things until they, you know, kind of get a little further down the road. So those are kind of going on, and I've now turned in the revised sequel to One Shot Harry, Ash Darkest Night, which is starts off smack dab in the middle of the Watts riots, the Watts uprising in '65, and Harry's right in the thick of things again. So I'm looking forward. That's going to drop in April of next year, so I'm looking forward to that. And working on a little novella, kind of more back in so that's sort of the crime fiction mystery realm, and then sort of back in the pulp realm. I'm working on a bit of a novella set in LA in the '70s, and kind of a mashup of two kinds of characters. Those kinds of characters that Fred Williamson and Jim Brown used to play in those blaxploitation movies back in the day, action adventure kinds of characters. So there's a Slade Fleetwood is that character, and then I have a kind of for the old timers out there, El Santo, which was like this masked luchador, masked Mexican wrestler, but he also did a series of these crazy films, you know, fighting Aztec vampires, or fighting Dracula, or fighting aliens from outer space. And so that kind of character, the Aztec tiger, shows up, and both the heroes at first clash, and then they have to work together, of course, to beat the bad guy. So anyway, I'm having a lot of fun writing that. It's going to be this kind of charged pulpish novella that are going to come out from a small press here in LA, probably in another year or so.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. We'd love to have you back on the show when the next book comes out.
Absolutely.
Gary Phillips, The Unvarnished Armando Pulp Collection. Gotta get it. There's a link in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, it is down below the video. Thank you so much, Gary, for joining us, sharing your insights and reading. Thank you so much to our audience for joining here and your great questions. Hope everyone has a wonderful night, and hope to see you at the next program.
Jean Paul, thanks for having me, man. It's been a blast.